Good evening and welcome to whoever is joining us right now on this live session, Tale of the Horse in Rajasthan, organized by Sahapedia. Um, Today's live session is a part of the Roots of Rajasthan project, partnered with the Royal Rajasthan Foundation, the social impact arm of Rajasthan Royals, to document the cultural heritage of the state of Rajasthan. And without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Yashaswini Chandra. Yashaswini is the author of The Tale of the Horse, A History of India on Horseback, her first book as a solo author. Uh, Rajasthan is one of her main areas of research. She has a PhD in History of Art from SOAS University of London, where she was also a teaching fellow. She has been a guest and visiting faculty at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and Ashoka University, Sonipat. She has worked for Sahapedia for many years, managing the multi volume documentation of the Rashtrapati Bhavan and an institutional collaboration with Rupayan Sansthan, Jodhpur. Yeshuswini is an avid horsewoman and has an interest in animal history. She previously co edited Right of the Line, The President's Bodyguard, on the household cavalry of the Indian head of state. Today, she will be talking about the history and romance of the horses in Rajasthan and how the animal has played a vital role in shaping Rajasthan's social life, sports, war, and trade. So, Yashaswini, welcome to Sahapedia's Facebook Live. The screen is all yours.
Thank you, Sindhuri. It's such a pleasure to be giving a talk on a Sahapedia platform because, as you rightly pointed out, I have been associated with Sahapedia for I was associated with Sahapedia for many years since its early days. And the two projects that you mentioned that I worked on behalf of Sahapedia, they have very much directly fed into this book. So, if I could just share my screen, I'm so glad that I was asked to give a talk focused on Rajasthan because, as you pointed out, Rajasthan is one of my areas of research. I've done extensive field work in Rajasthan, and it's very much at the heart of my book, The Tale of the Horse in India. So, I wanted to begin with this photograph that was taken during my days at Sahapedia, actually, when Dinesh Khanna, the photographer par excellence, and I went to the Pushkar fair, the livestock fair at Pushkar in 2017. And I wanted to begin with my presentation with this photograph. In fact, the color section in my book also begins with it because to me it's deeply evocative. It's from Rajasthan. I mean, it highlights the role of horse fairs such as Pushkar. I mean, now we associate Pushkar with camels, but in fact, it was a major center of horse trade. You know, horses were sold and bought at fairs such as Pushkar. Pushkar, of course, was the most important, but there were a number of them. Thereafter, and it's very reminiscent of some of the legends of some of the legends that I speak about in the book, the legend of the horse of Karbala, the legend of Mirza Sahiban, in which a riderless horse feature. This image immediately brought those legends to my mind. And also, it's a piebald horse, known in Hindi and Rajasthani as an ablak, right? And there was a taste for ablak horses in the traditional horse culture of India, which is still seen to date at places like Rajasthan. And if you notice, the horse is decorated with henna tattoos. That again is reflective of the way in which horses were historically ornamented in India. So, I mean, the book, like I was saying, the book is broadly concerned with the overall Indian scene, but the role of the horse in Indian history. But Rajasthan is at the heart of it. It's before I delve into Rajasthan, it's worth mentioning the main sources from which horses were historically imported into India, as well as some of the main horse breeding areas. So one source was Central Asia, all the way to the Eurasian steppes. Horses were imported through Afghanistan, through the Afghan corridor, either into northern India through, places like Lahore and Punjab, or through Sindh, Balochistan, and into Rajasthan, right? And horses were also imported by sea from the Middle East to the ports of the Indian peninsula. So Sindh, Gujarat, then all the different coasts, the ports on all the different coasts of South India. And the third source from where horses were imported was Tibet. So through Nepal, Bhutan, what is now known as Northeast India, into Bihar and Bengal. Besides, certain areas emerged as horse breeding territories. There was extensive breeding of horses. Horses were raised in herds. This includes, of course, what we call the Western frontier. So all the way from Punjab, encompassing Sindh, Balochistan, Rajasthan, and Gujarat, right? And in different Himalayan regions and Himalayan foothills. By the 18th century, the Deccan, horses also began to be bred in the Deccan. And by the 18th century, most of the horses that the Marathas were using were being bred in the Bhima River Valley. Now, why Rajasthan? Why did I choose to make a case study of Rajasthan? Why did I dedicate a number of chapters to Rajasthan? Because first of all, it would have been too much ground for me to cover if I had, if I had, all of India was just too much ground for me to cover. And I was afraid that regional specificities, the way in which the horse culture of India played out in different regions, would be lost. So, I decided on Rajasthan for the obvious reasons. It's one of my areas of research. I'm familiar with the place, the history, the culture. But apart from that, for some very good reasons. One, of course, is the romanticization of Rajasthan. As to date, actually, Rajasthan is perhaps most famous as an Indian horse territory. And some of it has to do with the romanticization of Rajputs as horse warriors, which developed in the colonial period. I mean, going back to the projects that I did for Sahapedia, here's another fantastic photograph by Dinesh Khanna of the President's Bodyguard. So this is the household cavalry of the Indian head of state. And, slots are reserved for Rajputs based on, ever since the British identified certain martial castes. The Rajputs were one of them, and slots to date are reserved in both the two remaining horse regiments of India. One, of course, is the President's Bodyguard, and the second is the 61 Cavalry. So, in popular imagination, Rajasthan has been the home of these Rajput horse warriors. Like I said, a lot of it has to do with the glorification of the Rajputs in the colonial period, with colonial historians such as James Todd highlighting that aspect of Rajput culture. But it so happens that the horse informed the rise of the Rajputs as the ruling class of Rajasthan. The horse was central to the assimilation of different Rajput states into the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire was based on the Mansabdari system, by which ranked officials, the Mansabdars, had to provide the Mughal army with a certain number of horse troops. So that and by about the end of 16th century, most of the Savars, most of the riders who were being recruited were from Rajasthan. And then very importantly, like I pointed out to you, the location of Rajasthan was also very conducive to its emergence as a horse territory. First of all, it was located between two of the main sources through which horses were being imported, right? So from Central Asia through Afghanistan, one of the routes led through the Khyber Pass into Punjab and on to Lahore, Delhi, Agra, major Mughal centers. The second actually led from Multan and later Shikarpur to Bahawalpur in present-day Pakistan, through Pugal and Bikaner all the way to Jaipur. And from there, these horses were dispersed all over India. By the 18th century, these horse traders, most of whom were Afghans, were also doing most of their business at all these different livestock fairs. Pushkar, of course, being the most important. Horses at the same time were also being imported from the Middle East, Arab Persian horses, through the ports of Gujarat and Sindh, and of course, within reaching distance of Rajasthan. Right? And Rajasthan has been home to a pastoral nomadic culture. So a number of pastoral nomadic communities have played a major role in breeding horses, in trading in horses, and all of that led to Rajasthan becoming a major horse territory, becoming renowned for that. Yeah. So speaking of Afghan horse traders, this is a painting from the turn of the 19th century, and obviously the Afghan horse trader was a commonplace enough sight for the master artist Bhakta, who was associated with the subcourt of Devgarh, subcourt of Udaipur Mewar, the Rajput state of Udaipur Mewar, and he painted this painting in which presumably an Afghan horse trader has brought a beautifully ornamented horse to court for sale. This all begins to change from the colonial period. So you have these rather fantastic, the colonists were fascinated by the Afghans, especially Afghan horse traders. That was another figure, the Afghan horse trader was another figure that was romanticized most memorably in Rudyard Kipling's Kim. The horse trader Mehboob Ali is supposed to be a very romantic figure, a figure of great intrigue, a spy who crossed boundaries seamlessly, etc., etc. And these kind of paintings are a reflection of that fascination with Afghan horse traders. But the flip side was that in the colonial period, the British had a very complicated relationship with Afghanistan. They weren't able to extend their imperial hold into Afghanistan. So they viewed Afghan migrants, a lot of them were mercenaries, soldiers, a number of them were employed by different Rajput states, and of course, horse traders. They viewed their activities with great suspicion and cracked down on them. And that brought about the decline of, that centuries old caravan trade by which horses were imported from the Eurasian steppes and the Central Asian heartland into India. This is, of course, reminiscent of that other form of trade, the sea trade that I was talking about, by which horses were packed into ships and and traveled by sea to different Indian ports. There is a very well-known romantic ballad of Dhula Maru from Rajasthan, which features an estranged couple, Dhula and Maru, right? And for the longest time, they're trying to pass messages between each other, and it's not possible until a horse trader intervenes. So the figure of the horse trader is very important, and what it signifies is the extensive fear of action of a horse trader. The horse trader was used to traveling from one place to another. He was catering to a very high-end clientele, so he had a lot of contacts, became a highly influential figure, right? Okay, coming to Rajasthan. So I've talked about the international players in this horse trade, at the heart of which was Rajasthan. The Afghan horse traders, the traders from the Middle East, Arabs, Iranians. But a number of communities from Rajasthan also became involved in that trade. Like, for example, the Charans and the Bhats, Bardic communities of Rajasthan, a number of persons from their ranks became quite renowned as horse traders. There's very little written information about the early history of Rajasthan. So for that, we turn to oral traditions such as the Epic of Babuji, to glean insights about the role of the horse in the early history of Rajasthan. And so the Epic of Babuji it's a tradition. There is an oral epic which is recited, although decreasingly so, recited and sung to date by Bhopa bard priests from the Bhil Nayak community. And there are also a number of stories, some of which have been written down from about the 16th century. And so you can look at different accounts of, the tradition of Babuji, the tale of Babuji, and glean certain insights. So it's a very, as you can imagine, a tale if the entire oral epic is recited, it takes 7 nights. So you can imagine how long and complex it is. But to cut a long story short, it features a blood feud between 2 groups of Rajputs, Babuji's Rathors and Jindrao's Khichi Rajputs, right? And what is incredible about this tradition, this tale, is that a horse is at the heart of it, right? That bitter rivalry between Jindrao and Babuji erupts after Babuji obtains this highly coveted black mare, Kesar Kalmi, right? And this black mare is given to Babuji by a Charan woman, a woman of the Bardic community, which is a reflection of 2 things. First of all, the involvement of certain Charan clans in pastoralism and animal trade, livestock trade, including horse trade. And second, in the adoption of Charan goddesses by Rajputs as their clan goddesses, right? And and just to point a few things out, there's also romance, a wonderful romance at the heart of it. Babuji, a princess of the Sodha clan of Rajputs from Umarkot, falls in love with Babuji. With great reluctance, he agrees to get married because before that he was a bit of a footloose bachelor who wanted to dedicate his life to warfare and adventuring. Anyway, he agrees to get married, and he arrives at Umarkot for his wedding, and he's depicted here as performing the Toran ceremony. So he's riding in his wedding procession on his decorated mare, his beloved mare, Kesar Kalmi. He's performing the Toran ceremony, by which he's striking the Toran, or the arch, at the entrance of his bride-to-be's house. Right? These were prestigious rituals performed by Rajputs and consequently adopted by a number of upwardly mobile castes of Rajasthan. And later it became contentious because certain lower caste communities were prevented from riding in their wedding processions on horses and performing the Toran ceremony. To date, there are instances of Dalit bridegrooms being prevented from riding in their wedding processions because, and it is a reflection of the elitism that came to be attached to the horse. Now, what the tale of Babuji shows us is one of the reasons there was such a desperate fight for this one mare. She's metaphorical. Because in the early history of Rajasthan, horses were actually difficult to come by. And there are lots of tales, lots of stories of Rajputs conducting raids by which they procured horses from Gujarat and from Sindh, right? It's only very gradually that horses became, and one of the reasons for that was during the Delhi Sultanate period, when North India was dominated by the Delhi Sultanate. As a matter of policy, the Delhi Sultanate monopolized the supply of horses, war animals, and sought to deprive their rivals, including the Rajputs. So horses were quite difficult to come by in this early period. But gradually, there are also stories about how important the horse became to Rajput identity, how a good Rajput had to be able to recognize the different qualities of a horse. And gradually, it became very clear that one of the markers of a Rajput was the horse. And which is why you have images like this. And the importance of the horse to the Western frontier is incredible. You have these equestrian statues of the Jacks of Kutch, right? A 71 horsemen and one horsewoman who were supposed to have come from across the sea into Kutch and liberated the local population from a tyrant. Rajput stables to date have a statue or an image of Revant, the god of horses. And of course, the Bhumiyas, like Babuji is a Bhumiya. A Bhumiya was a local hero who was deified after his death. After he died, protecting land or cattle, right? So these kind of Bhumiya icons you find to date all over Rajasthan. And these are just enduring reflections of the importance of the horse to Rajput identity and culture. Now, coming to the Mughal period was also quite crucial. The Mughal army was effectively a Central Asian army, right? It was based on, to begin with, it was very much based on Central Asian principles of warfare. And it featured cavalry, mounted archers, as well as the heavy cavalry, riders who fought from horseback with swords and spears. And also, Akbar instituted the Mansabdari system, by which an officer, a ranked officer, and high-ranking officers were nobles. Their status within the Mughal Empire depended on the number of horse troops they could provide, right? So a number of Rajputs became Mughal Mansabdars, and they were able to provide the Mughal army with a number of horsemen. And these images are just a reflection of the prestige attached to horses and horse sports, equestrian sports, and of course, mounted archery during the colonial period. So in this case, you have a competition by which a mounted archer is shooting a bag, right? And then you have this wonderful portrait from pretty late into the Mughal period, from the 18th century, early 18th century, of a mounted archer, right? So during the Mughal Empire, horsemanship became, reached an apogee of sorts. It became a matter of one's status within the Mughal Empire. It became a matter of tremendous prestige. And a lot of Rajput rulers and chiefs began to emulate that culture. The Mughals also also had themselves, the Mughal emperors had began the tradition of equestrian portraits, by which they were portrayed on horseback. For example, Akbar, almost all paintings of Akbar depict him on horseback. Almost all paintings of Akbar hunting depict him as hunting on horseback, right? Even when he is hunting big cats, lions and tigers. Now, if you look at the textual references, if you look at accounts of these, accounts of big game hunts by Akbar, it isn't always clear that the hunt was conducted from start to finish from horseback. But he chose to be, or at least he was always depicted hunting tigers and lions on horseback. This is one instance. And, the intention was to portray Akbar, as almost a superhuman. It was these paintings were intended to depict his sort of larger than life quality, that he was even able to hunt big cats from horseback. Then coming to Shah Jahan, subsequent Mughal emperors, equestrian portraits were also made of Jahangir, Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan was depicted again and again on a very specific kind of horse, the piebald, the ablak that I was talking about. And this is a reflection, an early reflection of the taste for ablak horses in the traditional Indian horse culture. In many cultures, the piebald or the skewbald, that is a horse with white and brown or bay patches, right? They were disdained, but in India there seems to have been a great taste for it, and horses were specially bred in the Middle East and in Central Asia, piebalds and skewbalds, for importing to India. Later Mughals, Aurangzeb, in comparison with his predecessors, so Jahangir and Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb's paintings, portraits tend to be very austere. But in the case of equestrian portraits, when he is depicted on horseback, they are as grand as those of any other previous Mughal emperors. And he is depicted haloed, so giving the impression of a sacred king, and which is interesting because normally we associate Aurangzeb with a much narrower view of a more, with more of more, we imagine that we think that his reign was motivated more narrowly by Islamic strictures. But if you look at his equestrian portraits, he's portrayed in the manner of his predecessors. This painting particularly is very interesting, very distinctive. He's in full armor, his horse is in full armor, he's haloed, and the impression very much is of a horse warrior king. Until about the 17th century, it was the Mughal emperors who were depicted on horseback in this manner. But gradually, as I will show you, Rajput rulers and chiefs, equestrian portraits of them also began to be produced. During the Mughal period, Mughal court artists also made paintings of favorite horses. So this is a beautiful portrait of Dil Pasand, beloved of my heart. The names are very evocative, whether it's from the Mughal chronicles or from Rajasthani records. The names of the horses themselves reflect the close bond, between these horses and their masters, and how much their masters valued their individual horses. So this is the Prince Dara Shikoh, Shah Jahan's eldest son. This is a painting of his favorite horse, Dil Pasand. And as we will see, a lot of the same strains later came to be seen in Rajput court art. Paintings were also produced of horses with their grooms or with attendants, which is based on a prototype in Persian art. Mughals also had these daggers made, with the hilt in the form of a horse head. And there are lots of references when I talk about the association of the Rajput rulers and chiefs with the Mughal Empire. There are a lot of references to Mughal emperors gifting favored Rajput rulers and chiefs with, expensive horses of prestigious breeds, imported horses, and vice versa. There are also instances, there are paintings, there are textual references to Rajputs gifting Mughal emperors with horses. And Mughal emperors also would gift them with these bejeweled daggers, many of which we would imagine featured, horse heads. It's just another material reflection of the importance of the horse to Mughal high culture. Yeah, coming to the role of the horse in the assimilation of, the Rajputs within the Mughal Empire. So until quite late, until well into the 16th century, if not the 17th, the Rajputs, in spite of the growing importance of the horse, preferred to fight on foot. So there are references to Rajputs, jumping off their horses and fighting on foot, with swords and spears. But you also have paintings such as this, which reflect the role of the horse in the socialization of Rajputs, Rajput Mansabdars within Mughal high culture, right? And the role of equestrian sports such as polo in forging an inclusive Mughal high culture. Now, remember that the Mughal elite and the Mughal nobility was very heterogeneous. It included Rajputs, it included Central Asian Turks, Iranians, Indian Muslims, all kinds of peoples, Afghans, right? And an overall, and equestrian sports played a very important role in creating a certain homogeneity, bringing about a certain inclusiveness within that, that heterogeneous high class. So coming to polo, this is a painting. This is an incredible painting with Jahangir at the center of it. He's accompanied by two of his sons, the princes Khurram, who later became Shah Jahan, and Pervez, and Bhau Singh, the Rajput ruler of Amer, what later became Jaipur, right? And so this is a very intimate portrait because here is the emperor in a friendly match, with his two sons. But the one person who is included within this, the other person who's included, the fourth player is a Rajput and a Kachwaha Rajput. And the Kachwahas, of course, the first Rajput wife taken by a Mughal emperor, Akbar, was a Kachwaha princess. Jahangir was himself the son of that Kachwaha princess turned Mughal consort. So, in fact, Bhau Singh was a relative, and you can see how important, how much he was considered a part of the larger imperial family, because here he is appearing alongside the emperor and his two young sons, and polo really blossomed as the sport of the kings under the Mughals. So there are lots of fabulous references to the Mughals playing polo by torchlight when they played polo at night. Balls made of palash wood, which were set on fire, were used, so it was still possible to play at night, right? And you can see how, in spite of the fact that they're playing a fast and furious game, they're all rather gorgeously dressed. So appearances clearly mattered in the Mughal high class. This is another painting that reflects, like I said, the importance of elite sports in forging that inclusive Mughal high culture and the close ties between the Rajputs, Kachwaha especially, and the Mughals. This painting from the Badshah-nama, or the illustrated copy of the Chronicle of Shah Jahan's reign, you have an instance when Aurangzeb, as a young prince, confronted a rampaging elephant. They were all watching. So Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb, Dara Shikoh, and one of the other young princes, Shah Suja, were all watching an elephant fight, and they were accompanied by Jai Singh of Amer. So this is another instance of a Rajput noble, a Rajput ruler in his own right, accompanying the Mughal, appearing as part of the innermost circle of the Mughal emperor. Here, he alone has joined the emperor and his sons in watching an elephant fight. And when the elephant fight goes wrong and an elephant charges towards Aurangzeb, who showed a lot of bravery and and didn't balk from confronting the elephant, it's the Mughal prince Shah Suja and Jai Singh, the Rajput Mansabdar, who rushed to his rescue, right? So he demonstrated the same instincts and the same riding style as the Mughal princes. Okay, coming to women. So I wanted to write an inclusive history of the horse in India because it was very important for me to demonstrate the extent to which horses were central to Indian history and culture, how they, they played a role across gender and class. So I looked into references to horsewomanship. And there's this historical painting from the Akbarnama, the Chronicle of the Reign of Akbar. And in that, there's a painting that shows that women, women, female servants of Mughal queens and princesses used to appear in public, in open, riding on horses covered from head to toe. So that's how they managed to. Now, if you remember elite women, whether they were Mughal women or Rajput women or later Maratha women, they were all practicing parda. They all had to be secluded. They couldn't be seen public. They couldn't be seen in public, right? So this is how these Mughal women used to be seen on horseback in public. There are no such historical paintings of women of elite Rajput households riding out in the open. There are very few textual references. They're very passing in nature. Like, for example, you might come across a very passing reference like such and such woman got on a horse, right? But there are lots of paintings of women not only riding but also hunting on horseback and playing polo. They tend to be quite idealized. They tend to be stock images, so they do not necessarily represent actual historical moments or actual historical persons. For example, in the Taragarh fort in Bundi, there are the usual highly romanticized images of women looking very beautiful, bathing, languishing, smoking the hookah, or languishing under a cloud-laden sky in the evening. But there are also these paintings of women riding and on horseback. What they do reveal, because in almost all these paintings, like in this painting, you see there are very similar paintings from Budi and Kota. So two Rajput courts, two adjoining Rajput courts with a shared history. The women are depicted in a very particular manner, adopting the same posture, attended by female servants. And what they reveal is the circumstances under which women, elite women in Rajasthan rode. So within secluded spaces, within, zinana quarters, and in the company of other women. So that's how they managed to ride under more normal circumstances. So, which is why there's this painting. So there are quite a few paintings from Jodhpur, Marwar, the Rajput court of Jodhpur, Marwar, of women playing polo, which reveals that women did in fact play polo. In one such paintings, it's a group of women alone. So you can imagine that women played polo amongst themselves, or they are accompanied by the Maharaja. So the husband in the case of the queens, the master in the case of the concubines, right? So those are the circumstances under which these women would have practiced horsewomanship, either by themselves, in the company of other women, or in the company of their main man, the Maharaja. So yeah, and interestingly in this painting, if you see, the women are all dressed rather like the Maharaja. They're even wearing turbans. So there is that interesting suggestion that women had to wear male attire, assume a certain, assume a masculine manner to be able to sit on a horse. So the horse, so not just in terms of warfare and polity, but the horse also became quite important to high Rajput courtly culture. Here I've been talking about equestrian sports. Then there are all these presentation scenes by which, rulers and chiefs examine prize horses, prized specimens. This is a very ceremonial scene. Everybody's beautifully dressed in pink, rather gloriously dressed in pink. You almost think it must be the Maharana's birthday and he's being presented with a particularly fine horse. Yeah. Then there are also instances of, like there is this one instance of Savan Singh of Kishangarh, Maharaj Kumar Savan Singh of Kishangarh, then a prince. He's quite well known for writing poetry, for his great romance with a court performer who came to be known as Bunny Thani, the paintings that were made of his romantic encounter. But what is less known is that he was also an artist himself, and he's quite fond of drawing horses. And one such sketch he made is of a Turkey horse and its rider, which I feel like is a bit of a satire, directed against the Turkey rider, the ethnic other. Because if you see, the horse is a gelding, it's a castrated horse. And this is a bit of a caricature, because here you see this is an emaciated figure, is bare feet, there are no stirrups, the mouth is pulled into a toothy sneer. It's quite a funny little portrait. And in the case of equestrian portraits of Rajput lords, they were always depicted in stallions. So perhaps a point is being made by depicting the Turkey rider on a gelding or a castrated horse. Then there's been this incredible tradition, the Shalihotra or the Ashwashastra tradition of horse knowledge. Some of it, it's very difficult to make sense of it because there are all kinds of absurd references to, there are all kinds of absurd references like that would seem absurd to us. Like, for example, if the horse has 6 auspicious world, then the master will be blessed with a son. Or if a horse has a certain marking, then don't buy that horse because that horse will bring doom on its master. Then a horse that defecates on the battlefield will bring ruin onto the master. So it's very difficult to make sense of that. I mean, obviously, there was a great concern with auspicious and inauspicious characteristics of a horse. And it was, and the horse was seen sort of as a magical being, and the aura of the horse, auspicious or inauspicious, negative or positive, could be transmitted to the rider, which is why there was this great concern with reading the signs to be able to distinguish a lucky horse from an unlucky horse. But the Shalihotra tradition, all the manuscripts that were produced within that tradition, were also reflective of the culture of connoisseurship that developed around the horse culture of the Rajputs. So it was very important. It became the sign of a cultured Rajput lord that he was a good judge of horse flesh. He was knowledgeable about all this horse lore. He knew how to distinguish a good horse, a lucky horse, an auspicious horse from a bad or an inauspicious horse, right? So, and which is why there's this one of my great discoveries. I found this painting in a private collection of a Rajput lord in assembly. So in Rajput court paintings, the central figure, the lord, was often depicted literally larger than life, larger than all the rest. And here he is very much sitting and having a look at this manuscript and discoursing on the finer points to his eager audience, which is probably lapping up every word he's saying. Yeah, and what I was talking to you about Shalihotra, the concern with auspicious and inauspicious signs. So in the case of this horse, these are all the worlds, that could be auspicious. Then the taste for piebald and skewbald horses, with the black patches, with the brown or bay patches. Then again, the role of the horse within the courtly culture, high courtly culture. Well, there's this incredible painting from Kota from the early 19th century that shows that horse fights were also conducted. So we know about elephant fights, we know about cock fights, but stallions were also pitted against each other, and that made for a lot of entertainment, presumably. Yeah. Now, I was talking about the influence of, Mughal horse culture on the Rajputs. Just as those portraits of beloved horses were being produced by Mughal court artists. I pointed out that portrait of Dil Pasand, Dara Shikoh's horse. You also had paintings of, prized horses being made for Rajput patrons by their court artists. So this is the Stallion Kitab. A painting was made by Bhavani Das, one of the master painters from the court of Kishangarh, right? And it's quite an incredible painting because, first of all, Kitab is, by the way, from Iraq or Iran. That is also specified. I can't remember which one. But that taste I was talking to you about, the taste, the elitist preference for imported horses, yeah, especially horses from the Middle East. There was a lot of prestige attached to them, which is why it is mentioned in the inscription that the horse is from Iran or Iraq. The name of the horse is given, Kitab. It's a piebald. Once again, the taste for ablak horses, the great love of ablak horses. And you see, the extent to which the horse was valorized is beautifully brought out in this painting, because the horse is the central character. The horse, is much bigger than all the men that surround him. And the men appear like pale figures, inconsequential figures, compared to, the boldly drawn and the richly colored horse. And the men seem to be offering the horse agarbatti, fumes, incense fumes to inhale. And the horse is being hailed with peacock feather fans. Yeah, so like a royal insignia. Then there's this incredibly beautiful portrait of a horse. The horse is not identified, neither is the name of the patron identified, but such a number of such paintings were produced of beautifully decorated and tacked up horses, ornamented horses, and those were probably intended for connoisseurs, for like connoisseurs of horses to buy and acquire as part of their collections. Okay, so I was talking about the romanticization of the Rajputs in the colonial period and the role of James Todd, right? And how the notion of the Rajput horse warrior became very prevalent. We all know about the Battle of Haldi Ghati and how Akbar sent an army to try and subdue Rana Pratap of Udaipur, of Mewar. Then it was, of Udaipur, Mewar, the Rajput state. And, ultimately Rana Pratap and the Rajputs fled the battle scene, but Akbar was not able to capture Rana Pratap. And so the Battle of Haldi Ghati can at best be considered a draw. But increasingly over time, all the bardic narratives, all the poetic narratives that came out of the Sisodia Rajput court of Udaipur Mewar projected Rana Pratap as the victor. Yeah. And James Todd, who was a colonial authority, he was the first political agent of the so-called Western Rajput states. He wrote an account of Haldi Ghati in which the Rana Pratap's horse Chetak is central, right? So, I mean, Todd's account is full of glaring errors. For example, the actual battle was commanded on behalf of the Mughals by Man Singh, a Kachwaha Rajput general. But in Todd's account, it was the Prince Salim, who later became Jahangir, who commanded the battle. And Rana Pratap came within inches of killing him. And you wonder what Todd's account was based on. Obviously, the bardic narratives, the oral traditions that were prevalent in Udaipur, Mewar, but also paintings like this which were produced. In which case, in all of which Rana Pratap and Chetak are depicted again and again as the central most characters, right? And Chetak has gone on to become India's most famous horse. There's a poem that a lot of us will have learned growing up. There are all these equestrian statues of Maharana Pratap mounted on Chetak. A scooter is named after Chetak. A train is, but what, in spite of all the factual errors that James Todd's account has, what that account does show us was the extent to which Rajputs identified with individual horses, the emotional connect between humans and horses, right? Chetak appears more Rajput than even the Rajputs. He is endowed with greater agency. He performs the greatest sacrifice. He ultimately dies in Rana Pratap's service, right? Yeah, now coming to the other classes, like I said, the horse culture of Rajasthan was not just restricted to the Rajputs. A number of other communities contributed, and the horse was experienced all over India and, of course, Rajasthan. But there are very few references to the other communities, the communities that might have bred horses or traded in them, or like the saises or grooms who might have actually looked after horses. So you have to really look around for historical references to them. And that social hierarchy by which the ruling Rajputs, their histories are well recorded, their position is highlighted, emphasized, glorified, whereas the histories of a number of other communities is absent. There's a real paucity of material about them, is reflected in equestrian portraits of Rajput rulers and chiefs, in which the horse and the rider, are the dominant figures. From a visual point of view, they're very much the dominant figures. They're the much bigger figures, and the attendants, right, appear unnaturally small in comparison. So it's like their lowered position within the social hierarchy is also reflected very literally in the art. The equestrian portraits, like from about the 18th century, after the Mughal Empire began to lose force, and the Mughals stopped being, increasingly they began to, the so-called decline of the Mughal Empire had started. That's from when Rajputs, rulers and chiefs began to have themselves portrayed on horseback in the manner of their one-time overlords, the Mughal emperors. But in all these paintings, but what is unique about these equestrian portraits of Rajputs is that they were always surrounded by attendants carrying royal insignia, like, for example, the yak tail fan, the chori, right? And the attendants, like I said, in a reflection of the social hierarchy, are diminutive, minuscule figures compared to the horse and its Rajput rider. So it's like the horse and the rider lend each other stature, right? Only the Rajput ruler is tall enough, metaphorically speaking, to be mounted on a horse. Yeah, and these paintings increasingly became highly standardized and stereotypical, but the attendants just continue to become smaller and smaller in size. So much so that the chori bearer very often disappears behind the horse, right? And all you can see is like the tuft of his chori or yak tail fan. Yeah, but who were these people? Like I said, a lot of, apart from the Afghans and say the traders from the Middle East doing business in Rajasthan, a lot of the horse trade was in the hands of the Charans and the Bharts, Bardic communities, mobile communities that traveled all over the place to cater to different patrons, right? So in any case, they had mobility. Then, as the bards to the Rajputs, as the preservers of Rajput history in a way, they also had a lot of clout and a lot of influence, right? And the Charans, for example, also became caravan protectors. Since they were the bards to the ruling class of Rajputs, since their goddesses were adopted as clan goddesses by the Rajputs, a certain sacred character was associated with the Charans and also the Bharts, these two bardic communities, right? And they could do trade in Rajasthan. They were, exempt from paying taxes, right? And they made the most of their privileged position and began to trade in horses. Like I was mentioning to you, the horse trade was highly lucrative, so these communities would want to become, involved in such a profitable trade, right? And here you have, and the Charans and Bharts as bards to Rajput rulers and chiefs also had that kind of access. So this painting shows that here, a very finely dressed horse trader has got a very special horse to either present or probably to sell to the ruler of Kota. Yeah, and there are a number of legends of Charan goddesses endowing, favored Rajput chiefs with horses that allowed them to establish their rule over different parts of Rajasthan. Again, it is a reflection of the involvement of the Charans, that horse trade. Yeah. So horses weren't just being ridden into battlegrounds and polo grounds, right? Horses were also ridden by a lot of like bandit classes. So a lot of bandits, a lot of robbers, and different parts of Rajasthan which were very remote. Whenever caravans traveled through them, horses were a major, horses and cattle, camels, they were a major item of loot, right? So large parts of Rajasthan were in principle, but not in reality, under the control of Rajasthan, even though it was supposed to be under the control of the Mughal emperor and the Mughal empire and, different Rajput rulers and chiefs. Remote parts were a world unto themselves, right? And the Rajput chiefs of these places had no compunction raiding caravans of horses, for example, right? And then a lot of other communities like the Bhils, yeah, a tribal community of Rajasthan, they considered it their customary right to levy taxes on caravans passing through their strongholds. And in case they weren't able to, they weren't able to extract those taxes, then they would very often loot like the horses or cattle or camels and then sell them through middlemen, right? And in the case of, like I was talking to you about Dhula Maru, right? At one point, Dhula and Maru are chased by a group of horsemen who are described as the prowlers of the desert. So a lot of bandit classes, marauding classes, they also rode horses. They also had access to horses, and they conducted all their activities from horseback. Coming to the all important saises, the grooms who actually looked after horses, there was such a huge industry. I mean, horses were so central once upon a time in the so-called age of the horse. When warfare depended on horses, there was so much transportation. Horses were one of the main means of transportation. So you can imagine the horses were so ubiquitous that an entire industry would have surrounded them. And social identities were being formed around the horse, not just the identities of elite soldiering classes like the Rajputs and the Marathas, but also of other classes. Like, for example, a distinct community of Bhil Nayaks emerged, who actually began to first be called Nayaks after they began to serve the Rajputs as saises or grooms, right? So then saddlers, people who made the equipment of a horse, an entire subcaste of the cobbler caste, the mochi caste, the zingar mochis emerged, who specialized in producing horse tack, right? So the identities were being formed, which is one of the reasons there are not just equestrian portraits of horses being ridden by elite Rajput men, but there are also paintings of different horses, along with their grooms or their attendants. The groom and the attendant, and if you recall, and again, it's a reflection of the social hierarchy, that the groom always appears rather a tiny figure in comparison with the horse. The horse is depicted in the manner of an elite animal, a huge animal, right? A beautiful, powerful, larger than life animal, whereas the lowly groom is almost always reflected as quite small in size. So his social standing is rather graphically depicted in this manner. Yeah, but like here, and this is an incredible painting. In some of these horse and groom paintings by the artist Bhakta, the name of the horse is given. Not only is the horse the focus of the painting, right, and is a large figure, but even the name of the horse is given. In the case of this painting, the horse is called Mira Bagas, but the name of the lowly groom remains anonymous. Yeah. Then there's another very famous painting by Bhakta of Rawat Gokul Das, the chief of Devgarh, a lord of Devgarh, and his entourage having gone on a little jaunt to to a retreat within a lake, right? And this painting has been studied extensively in terms of the aristocratic pastimes that are taking place within the retreat. But there are other elements of the painting that throw light on, the role of grooms in upholding the horse culture of the region. So if you take a very close look, you'll see there are these absolutely fabulous details, a reflection of Bhakta's imagination and mastery. These grooms who are mounted on their horses have taken their horses into the lake, in order to give their horses and themselves a bath. And they're also depicted grazing their horses, right? Yeah, like I said, it's a bit of a struggle to find information about, the role of these lower status groups in it's difficult to find references to their contributions to the horse culture. But in the book, I have drawn attention also to the role of grooms or saises. I've drawn attention to the experience of the horse by ordinary soldiers, by saddlers, and also by farriers who shoot the horse, right? And there are paintings like this one of the shoeing of the horse from different Indian regional contexts. So in art, you find a more rounded view, a more diverse view of the place of the horse, the life of the horse in India. So I think that's pretty much it. Duri, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. That broadly is the role of the horse in the history of Rajasthan. And if there's anything I can, if there are any questions or anything of that sort.
We have some questions coming in on the chat box. I'll just read it out for you. Um, so the very first question says, it was mentioned in your introduction that you are interested in animal history. So why did you choose to write your first book on horses?
Well, that's a very good question. There is increasing interest in animal histories. I think we are beginning to realize that there is more to the world, including our historical experience of it, than the deeds of great men. So increasingly, there has been interest in animal history. It's a growing field in India. I mean, Divya Bhanu Singh has written some fantastic books on the history of the lion, the cheetah, and the rhino. There's been some literature. Then even some great scholars like Romil Thapar have written about it. So I thought I might contribute to the growing interest in animal history. And of course, horses was the animal, I think, of the history of the horse has been very closely intertwined with the history of humans. So to view India through the lens of the horse, for me, has been quite rewarding. As I write in the epilogue to my book, if I can just read that line. To view India in relation to the horse is to see famous characters, the familiar figures of certain emperors and kings, or even some prolific artists in an altered light. At the same time, the horse can lead us into remote corners and towards new people, plenty of which and whom slip through the cracks of great histories, not to mention the animals themselves. So, yeah, in the case of studying the history of the horse in India, I didn't just learn about the horse as an elitist, as an elite animal, as an animal associated with kings and emperors, but I also learned about the different horse breeding regions, some of which were quite remote. I learned about the communities that were involved with breeding horses, trading in horses. The histories of these communities don't always get written. And I think it's very important to remember that there was a historical partnership between humans and horses. There was a great emotional connect. Riders, owners, even caretakers associated in a very emotional way with their horses. Like that, the legend of Rana Pratap and Chetak really encapsulates that. So, I thought it was worth remembering and worth reflecting on. And of course, I am also deeply interested in horses, as Sindhuri pointed out. So there's definitely that personal interest.
Right. Um, so there's another question that says, do we know how horses were cared for in the past? And how did you get to know about this part of history?
Good question. We have some idea. Like, for example, in the case of Rajasthan, there are some references. Rajasthan was very rich in grasslands. Parts of it was, many parts of Rajasthan were not conducive to agriculture, obviously. But it had the grasslands to enable, raising of horses in herds. One of the reasons why such large number of horses used to be imported into India is because not enough horses were being bred in India to meet the entire demand. And like I mentioned, there was also a certain elitist preference for foreign imported horses, right? But Rajasthan was one of the regions where there was enough grass. There were practices by which grass was cut and stacked as fodder. So yeah, there are some references. They're not very telling. The references in the Shalihotra or the Ashvashastra are very difficult to make sense of. Like, it'll say like if a horse is not feeling well, then rub its dung all over it. I mean, if you look at all the historical references to horse care from the perspective from the modern point of view, then some of them might seem quite appalling. But but it was based on a certain lived experience. And yeah, you do find lots and lots of references to what horses should be fed. So yeah, I mean, you have to really look around to write animal history. The animals weren't writing their own histories. So you have to really sort of dig deep and and look around and be quite imaginative to find references and sources.
Right. I think people have a lot of questions about the social life of the animal as well. Somebody is asking, apart from the elite class, what do you think was the animal's relationship with the working class in context to perhaps trade or leisure activities?
Well, that's a really good question. So, like, the horse was never a farming animal. It was never a farm animal in India. In Europe, for example, certainly from the time of the agricultural revolution, much of the plowing and the tilling was, the plow used to be pulled by horses, right? Whereas in India, the plows were pulled by oxen. And also, in fact, when I was talking about all those sort of female servants of Mughal women, high Mughal women, riding on horseback. A European traveler, Peter Mundi, mentioned that women of lesser status used to ride oxen. Yeah, so the horse was never the horse did become a bit of an elitist animal in India because it was mostly associated with warfare, with as a status symbol. But having said that, different communities did make use of the horse in different ways. Like in Rajasthan, until recently, the Kumhars or potters used to use their horses to ferry, to ferry their ware, and and in Barmer, in the Barmer area, for example, to date, different communities breed and keep horses of a few horses of their own, one or two, which they use which they use to travel because they still find that horses can navigate those sandy tracks better. Because Rajasthan, the history of Rajasthan has been a pastoral region. um, we can imagine that for their own purposes, most people had a horse or two, and even bred horses, just to meet their own needs, just to be able to travel. Then, like I mentioned, the Charans and the Bharts, the horse traders from amongst them actually traded in horses. They actually became their mainstay. They rose to very prominent, influential positions by virtue of dominating that horse trade. I mentioned those prestigious rituals by which only Rajputs and upper caste could ride in their wedding processions and perform the Toran ceremony. Very few communities in Rajasthan, except the lowest of the low communities, were forbidden from riding your horses. But there are also instances of not only the Rajputs, but certain upper castes preventing bridegrooms from castes lower than theirs from emulating the Rajputs and riding in their wedding processions, right? So in that case, whether a lower caste groom aspires to ride a horse, right? That is his relationship with the horse. He wants to be able to ride in his wedding procession on a horse, right? And certain socially dominant castes will resist that because they think that they alone have the prerogative to be able to ride this animal. So yeah, it's complicated. There definitely it wasn't just the elite classes. The horse was being experienced all over India. It was central. It was ubiquitous. It was like you know like cars are today. So horses, it would have been a very commonplace sight, and different people would have experienced it in different ways.
Right. Um, there's another question that says, were horses also given as gifts of diplomacy?
Yeah, there are lots and lots and lots of references, and there's this rather marvelous story. The Shah of Iran was quite fond of, because there was a great love of Arab Persian horses in India. So the Shah of Iran was quite fond of sending Mughal emperors prestigious gifts of horses. So fine horses from the Middle East, fine Arab and Persian horses. And in fact, Jahangir and the Shah Abbas of Iran were quite fond of exchanging exotic gifts. So Jahangir would send him a zebra, for example, and the Shah would send Jahangir, you know, absolutely marvelous horses. And there was one horse that the Shah of Iran sent to Akbar, that Akbar in turn gifted to his son Danyal, one of his younger sons, if not his youngest son. And after Danya, as a special, as a token, as a great token of fatherly love, and then and you can imagine a horse that has been gifted to the Mughal emperor by the Shah of Iran. What a high value present that would have been, and and how fond Akbar would have felt of his son then to be able to pass that horse on to his son. And then after Daniel died, I believe from excessive drinking, then the horse reverted to the stables, the royal stables. By then, Jahangir was the Mughal emperor. And Jahangir in turn gifted the horse to Man Singh, the the Rajput ruler of Amer, the Kachwaha Rajput ruler of Amer. And Jahangir writes in the Jahangir Nama that he was so happy it was such a beautiful horse, and the entire nobility was agreed that there was no better horse in Hindustan. And Man Singh was so thrilled with that present that even if I had given him a kingdom, he wouldn't have been as happy. Yeah. And it is another reflection of the close bond between the Mughal emperors and the Kachwahas.
Right. Um, okay, I think it's time to take the last question.
Okay.
Somebody asked, what, as per you, is the reason for the decline of the indigenous horse in India, and what can be done to attain its past glory?
Okay, that's a beautiful question to end in. If my major concern in this book has been to establish the emergence of Indian breeds, indigenous breeds, all the more so because their use is highly diminished and a lot of these breeds are endangered. And we can blame the British for that. So along came the colonists. Even before the colonists came, there was, elite classes preferred foreign imported horses, right? It's the same logic by which a foreign imported car will be considered more prestigious than, I don't know, like an example, like a Maruti or something. Um, um, but then the British came along and they were highly discouraging. But having said that, by the 18th century, certain communities like the Rajputs and the Marathas preferred to ride horses, local horses bred by them, and and by the 18th century, large numbers of horses were being bred in India. Much of the demand for horses was being met by the local supply. But along came the British, and they were like, "Oh, Indian horses are rubbish." Just like just like the Indian race is not up to the mark. Their animals are not up to the mark. It's almost like scientific racism extended to the animals. Hmm? And they blamed, the Indian climate for all of India's problems. So the animals are not up to the mark because the climate is not conducive. This is not nice. This is not an environment in which horses can flourish. And look at all these small animals. And look at all these small horses. They were obsessed with size. It's very weird. And there are references to colonial officials saying, "Oh, these Rajputs, they seem to prefer small horses. How odd." And they started importing vast numbers of horses, European horses, and horses from Australia and South Africa that they tried to use to improve the strains of horses in India, improve according to them. And that led to a decline of the indigenous breeds. And then the taste for horses in India became Europeanized. So, Indian upper classes that increasingly became anglicized started to emulate the manner and the tastes and the preferences of their Western masters, began to, started to ride and breed, horses of European origin. Like, for example, the thoroughbred, they adopted equestrian sports that were popular with the British. So that's when it went horribly wrong. And then the British also cracked down on pastoral nomadism. And as I was mentioning, a lot of the horse breeders drew from those classes. So obviously that also led to a decline in breeding. And what can we do now in Rajasthan? I believe there are indigenous horse societies which are very active and that have done much to preserve these breeds. I think we can become more aware, more interested. Mainstream, urban, elite equestrianism in India is along international standards. So, indigenous horses are not represented in that scene. So yeah, I think we can be aware, and we can we can support all these different groups and societies that have taken a lead in preserving a number of these breeds.
Right. I think that's about it. So thank you so much, Yashaswini. Thank you for taking out the time.
Thank you, Sindhuri. It was such a pleasure to be back
Thank you.
With the Sahapedia.
Yes, it's been quite some time you've come back to Sahapedia.
Yeah.
Many congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
once
Thank you
again.
so much.
And
Thank
I
you.
would like to thank Royal Rajasthan Foundation to have supported this talk and for you to have agreed to come. Thank you
It's
so
my
much.
pleasure.